Morning everybody, happy Monday. It's a new week, so I say cheers to that. Now, the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about this idea of languages getting rusty and how do you get back to a language, how do you revive those skills. And today I want to talk a bit about a sort of observation that I have personally had over the years learning many languages and, having a number of those languages get rusty several times over in some cases. Now, fairly recently, I made a video where I spoke in 8 languages totally spontaneously. I just got done filming one video and I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna speak in all my languages except for Mandarin Chinese at the time, and I'm going to talk about how each language that I know, it seems to atrophy in a slightly different way, a slightly different pace. So today I want to dig into that topic a little bit more because I think there's a lot to say there, and very often, a lot of people will talk about how, yes, the stronger your language skills get, the more slowly they will atrophy, and I've spoken about that, and I've also talked about this idea of the language learning barrier where, it's almost like you're learning, beginner, intermediate, and there's this barrier that after you cross it, your skills atrophy a lot more slowly, it seems. But there's also another component that I don't think people talk about as much, and maybe this is a bit more subjective, but certainly in my case, I have found this sort of quality. So the reason why I brought up that video where I spoke in those 8 languages, it's because not only did I talk about this topic, but also when I made that video, I hadn't really had much opportunity to speak or study pretty much any of my foreign languages for a long time. I was mostly focusing on Mandarin Chinese at the time as a new language. So most of my languages that I spoke in that video, they had loads of time to get rusty, to atrophy. So you really get a very raw look at exactly where my skills were in their sort of maintenance state where I'm not really putting any effort into them. So why is all this important? Well, it's because in my experience, I have found that the languages that I have spoken the most, so the languages in which I've spoken to people, I've had sort of real life experiences, I've been out in the world, I'm communicating with people, those languages always seem to atrophy a lot more slowly than languages where I haven't spoken them as much. Now, I remember years and years ago, Steve Kaufman, who many of you might know, is a well-known polyglot. He used to talk about how his Russian at the time was extremely good in terms of comprehension. He had been studying Russian for a long time. He had read tons and tons of books and novels and articles. He had listened to tons and tons of podcasts, and he felt like his Russian skills, especially comprehension skills, were incredibly good. And this is fairly common for people, myself included, who like to do a very input-based approach where your initial part of the journey learning a language is very heavily based on taking in input and sort of expanding your vocabulary, expanding your knowledge of grammatical structures, and sort of being comfortable processing the language via input. And then later you start to speak when you actually have more things to say and you have a sort of framework of that language that allows you to express yourself. Well, the other thing that Steve would say at that time is that he found, even though he had such a vast vocabulary in Russian and loads of experience with input, he found that Russian would atrophy a lot more quickly than other languages where maybe he didn't have as large of a vocabulary or as rich of a sort of content input-based experience, but languages that he had spoken to people a lot more, languages where he had a lot more sort of life experience, and how those languages seemed to atrophy a lot more slowly, and that has been my experience as well. So one example for me is the Italian language. Now, Italian's a language that I, at one point, really did speak quite well. I would say, on the CEFR scale, I think I was definitely a pretty strong C1. I was comfortable not only expressing myself with sort of complex thoughts and fairly complex conversations, but I also was starting to develop a really good sense of sort of nuance of the Italian language, understanding sort of what phrases and collocations were appropriate for different scenarios. I was even beginning to read just my first ever novel in Italian. I read a few pages here and there. I was starting to read poetry. And honestly, I think my Italian was actually better than my Spanish has ever been. But the thing about Italian for me is that I actually have spoken very little Italian to people. I did have one friend in particular. Her name was Valentina. She was a really great friend of mine for quite some time, and we would exchange audio messages quite often. So I did get some exposure, but it was one person, and it wasn't a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but it also was mostly like audio messages and not real conversations. Now, I did go and live in Italy for a very short time. I was only there for about a month. But while I was in Italy, I didn't really have in-depth conversations. I had a lot of, ordering a cappuccino or having small talk with the barista or perhaps a waiter, or, I met a few people. But again, in the grand scheme of things, I really didn't actually speak that much Italian with other people. Now, if we jump to Spanish, like I mentioned, I think my Spanish, it was also pretty good. I mean, it's fine now, but it was also probably bordering on a C1, I think. But my Spanish was never quite as good as I felt like my Italian was. However, Spanish is a language that I have loads of experience speaking to people. I've been learning it for a long time. I used to speak it with sort of students at my high school in the US when I was playing basketball there. They had students from El Salvador, from Mexico, from Puerto Rico. I would speak to all of them. And then I lived in Barcelona twice for a total of about 7 or 8 months. And again, obviously had a lot of really great in-depth conversations there. It's just all throughout the last, 10 years, I've had a lot of experiences speaking Spanish to people. And so I find that my Spanish atrophies a lot more slowly. It's so much more secure in my brain and in my memory than Italian, even though Italian, I think, was actually stronger at one point. Now, it's the same thing for Japanese. So Japanese is a language many of you will know. I have loads of experience doing a whole variety of interesting things in the Japanese language. I lived in Japan, but really only for a fairly short time, 7 or 8 months total. But while I was there, I was an interpreter, doing all kinds of really interesting projects. Then I was a barista in a Japanese cafe, had to learn keigo and everything else. I was a student in a Japanese university. I was writing a novel in Japanese at one point. I don't think I've shared that before on the channel. I've just done a lot of things in Japanese. And so even though Japanese is probably the most difficult language in my personal list to maintain, because with French, it's so closely related to Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. So if I'm learning Spanish for 6 months, it kind of really helps me maintain my French because they're so closely related, where Japanese is just so different than any of the other languages that I've had in my repertoire over the years. And so there's very little ability for me to maintain Japanese via association. And frankly, I have spoken Japanese actually very little over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, to be honest. It's not a language I've had a lot of opportunity to really speak on a deep level. However, even now, there was a video that I'll link in the description. I'll also link it on the screen here for my daily language series, where I just decided to just speak in Japanese and French and Portuguese one day. And I can still turn it on. I can still use Japanese very comfortably. I'm sure I make a lot more mistakes now. Maybe my accent's not as good as it used to be. But again, it's like even after all these years, because I've spoken Japanese so much in the past, it seems to really atrophy a lot more slowly. Same thing with French. It's another language where I have an enormous amount of experience, both learning, reading books, listening to podcasts, but also working in a French company as a French employee, speaking French with people, traveling. So this video is a bit more of just an observation. I'm really curious to get your thoughts in the comments for those of you who are comfortable sharing, to see if you've had the same experience. Again, I remember very vividly hearing people like Steve talk about this many years ago, and it's always been my experience as well. So while I am a huge advocate of input-based learning, and that's the way that I choose to learn languages, and that's how I feel most comfortable, and that's also what works best for me. There's this interesting sort of observation and sort of fact, if you will, for me that I can't really ignore. It really does seem that having those real life experiences and, all those memories that are not necessarily studying, but they're real life memories embedded in my brain, having those attached to the language itself, it seems to have a big impact on how well I can sort of maintain my language skills, even if I'm not actually studying. Okay, everybody, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you have a great Monday, a great new week. I'm gonna have another sip of coffee. Well, it's probably cold now. Still okay. I'll see you back here on Wednesday for another awesome episode.